It happened in an instant, a crackling sound that silenced the cabin. Every head turned as the echo of the slap settled over the stunned passengers. Mr. Thomas stood motionless, his face calm yet unyielding, his eyes locking onto the flight attendant as if weighing the measure of her actions. Maya, standing beside him, was anything but calm. "Do you even know who you just hit?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. "He owns this plane." As we delve into this story, if you believe everyone should be treated with respect, no matter how they look or what their color is, click the subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from. Mr. Thomas was a man who never needed to prove his worth. At 60 years old, he had built an empire that stretched across industries, a legacy rooted in hard work, resilience, and integrity. But despite his vast wealth, he lived simply, preferring the quiet strength of humility to the loud display of opulence. That morning, his routine was no different. He stood in his modest bedroom, carefully packing his suitcase with deliberate precision. Plain shirts, comfortable slacks, and practical shoes, choices that spoke to a man who valued substance over style. A framed photograph of his late wife sat on the bedside table, and for a moment his eyes lingered on it. There was no need for words. The quiet memory said everything. Across the city, Maya, his niece, was moving at a pace that could only be described as chaotic. At 30, she was as fierce as they came, a voice for justice, sharp, determined, and unrelenting. She rushed about her apartment, stuffing papers and a laptop into her bag while responding to messages on her phone. Her uncle's text buzzed on the screen. "Remember, we're leaving in an hour. Pack light." She rolled her eyes with a smirk. Pack light was one advice she never took seriously. But then again, Uncle Thomas knew that. The trip was important. For Mr. Thomas, it was a chance to speak at a global conference, to share stories of resilience and inspire change. For Maya, it was an opportunity to stand beside the man she admired most and show that the fight for justice spanned generations. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Travelers hurried past, luggage wheels rattling on polished floors, while announcements echoed faintly overhead. Thomas moved through the crowd with his characteristic calm, a man completely at ease in any setting. At 60 years old, Thomas's presence was unassuming but assured. Dressed modestly, he carried himself like a man who didn't need to announce his importance. Beside him, his niece Maya walked with a quicker pace, her expression betraying her impatience. "Uncle, you could at least let people know who you are," she teased, glancing at him with a playful smirk. "And why would I do that?" Thomas replied, his voice calm, almost amused. Maya shook her head, unable to hold back her grin. "One day, you'll get tired of people underestimating you." Thomas simply smiled, the corners of his lips lifting faintly. "That day isn't today," he said. They reached the security line, navigating the routine with practiced ease. Maya muttered about the hassle of removing her laptop from her bag, while Thomas breezed through, his calm demeanor seemingly making the process smoother for him. At the boarding gate, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Passengers gathered in clusters, some clutching boarding passes, others immersed in their phones. A few sat in silence, sipping overpriced coffee from the airport cafe. Olivia, the lead flight attendant, stood near the gate, overseeing the boarding process with practiced efficiency. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair neatly pinned back, her smile perfectly rehearsed. She had the air of someone who thrived on control, someone who prided herself on maintaining order. Her gaze swept over the crowd, scanning faces as she mentally categorized passengers. Frequent flyers, first-timers, families with kids, business travelers. When her eyes landed on Thomas and Maya, her smile faltered ever so slightly. It was a moment so brief most wouldn't have noticed, but Maya did. As boarding began, Olivia greeted each passenger with the warmth of a well-trained professional. "Welcome aboard, sir. Enjoy your flight." Her tone was polished, almost cheerful. When Thomas and Maya stepped forward, her demeanor shifted. The smile remained, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her tone became clipped, her words quick and impersonal. "Welcome aboard." Maya caught the subtle difference immediately. She shot a glance at her uncle, but Thomas didn't react. He simply nodded politely and guided her forward. "Did you notice that?" Maya asked in a hushed tone once they were out of earshot. "Notice what?" Thomas replied, his expression calm as ever. "She practically rolled her eyes at us," Maya said, her voice laced with irritation. Thomas shook his head gently. "Let it go. It's not worth it." Maya sighed but didn't argue. She trusted her uncle's judgment, even if she didn't always agree with his approach. Still, the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't go away. If, like Maya, you cannot stand prejudice or injustice of any kind, click on the subscribe button now. As they made their way down the jet bridge, Olivia's eyes lingered on them for just a moment longer than necessary. There was no malice in her gaze, but there was something else. Something unspoken. And just like that, they stepped onto the plane, unaware of how quickly this seemingly ordinary flight would unravel. The cabin hummed with quiet activity. Passengers settled into their seats, some scrolling through their devices, others flipping through magazines or sipping the champagne that had been handed out moments earlier. The faint clink of glasses mingled with the soft murmur of conversations. Olivia moved briskly through the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor. Her posture was straight, her movements efficient, each gesture practiced to the point of precision. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed they knew exactly who deserved their attention, and who didn't. At the far end of the aisle, Thomas sat with a calmness that seemed unshakable, his hands folded neatly on his lap. Beside him, Maya watched the cabin with a quiet intensity. She was alert, her gaze flicking between passengers, her expression a blend of curiosity and unease. The flight attendant stopped near a couple seated 2 rows ahead of Thomas and Maya. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell?" Olivia's voice was warm, almost cheerful. Her smile lingered as the couple nodded and thanked her. She picked up their empty glasses, exchanged a few polite words, and moved on. When she approached Thomas and Maya, the warmth faded. She walked past their row without so much as a glance, her tray still half filled with drinks. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. She glanced at her uncle, expecting him to speak up, but he remained silent. Minutes passed. Olivia returned to the aisle, this time stopping at the row across from them. "Another glass of champagne, sir?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of pleasant familiarity. She poured the drink with a steady hand, smiling as the man thanked her. Maya shifted in her seat, her patience wearing thin. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. Olivia turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yes?" "We haven't been offered anything yet," Maya said, keeping her voice even. Olivia's lips curled into a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be with you shortly," she said, the words clipped and dismissive. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away. Maya let out a quiet breath, leaning toward her uncle. "Did you see that?" she murmured. Thomas didn't look up. "Let it go," he said calmly. "There's no need to make a scene." Maya frowned, her frustration simmering just below the surface. "It's not about making a scene, uncle. It's about respect." Thomas glanced at her, his expression serene. "Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." Maya sat back, crossing her arms. She didn't agree, but she respected her uncle too much to argue. Olivia returned a few moments later, her tray now empty. She paused near their row, her eyes scanning the cabin as if she hadn't noticed them at all. Then, as she turned to walk away, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for them to hear. "Some people don't know how to behave in first class." Maya's head snapped up, her gaze locking onto Olivia's retreating figure. She glanced at Thomas, expecting him to react, but he remained composed, his expression unchanged. "Excuse me," Maya called out, her voice firm. Olivia stopped, turning slowly, her smile forced and thin. "Yes?" Maya tilted her head slightly, her tone measured but pointed. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" Olivia's smile didn't waver, but her eyes betrayed her irritation. "Not at all," she said smoothly. "Why would there be?" Maya's gaze didn't falter. "That's what I'd like to know." The tension between them hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching with barely concealed curiosity. Thomas reached out, placing a gentle hand on Maya's arm. "Let it go," he said quietly. "She'll learn more from grace than confrontation." Maya hesitated, her jaw tightening as she considered his words. Finally, she leaned back, her gaze dropping. "If you were in Maya's shoes, how would you have handled this situation?" Share your thoughts in the comments below and hit the subscribe button now to join us in standing up for justice. Olivia turned without another word, walking briskly down the aisle. Maya watched her go, her mind racing. Something about the flight attendant's behavior didn't sit right with her. She glanced at her uncle, who remained as calm as ever, but her instincts told her this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted subtly, the quiet murmur of passengers mingling with the hum of the engines. It should have been a peaceful journey, one where people reclined in their plush seats, sipped their champagne, and settled into the comfort that first class promised. But something wasn't right. Olivia moved through the aisle with the same sharp efficiency she had displayed since boarding began. Her demeanor was polished, her uniform crisp, her smile carefully measured, but her actions carried an edge, one that became sharper each time she approached Thomas and Maya. It began as a small moment, a flicker of hesitation that others might have overlooked. But Maya didn't. Olivia's lingering glance at their row, her pause before speaking, the subtle furrow of her brow. Maya noticed it all. "Excuse me," Olivia said, her voice polite but with a tone that suggested otherwise. She stopped in front of their seats, her clipboard in hand. "I just want to confirm. Are you certain you're in the correct seats?" Maya's head snapped up. Her expression shifted from calm curiosity to barely contained irritation. "Do we need to show you our tickets again?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable sharpness. Olivia's smile didn't falter, but the faintest hint of condescension crept into her voice. "No need to get defensive," she said, holding her clipboard a little closer. "I'm just following protocol." Nearby, passengers shifted in their seats. A woman across the aisle glanced over, her eyebrows raised in quiet surprise. A young man a few rows back angled his phone slightly, the glow of his camera unmistakable as he began recording the exchange. Maya sat forward, her tone growing louder. "Protocol? Is that what this is about? Or is it something else entirely?" Olivia blinked, the mask of professionalism slipping for just a moment before she caught herself. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean," she said, her tone growing tighter. "You know exactly what I mean," Maya countered, her voice cut through the cabin like a sharp blade. "You've been treating us differently since we got on this plane. Why is that?" A hush fell over the nearby passengers. Some exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared openly, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Olivia stiffened, the tension radiating from her stance. "I treat all passengers the same," she said firmly. "No, you don't," Maya shot back. "You skipped over us during drinks. You've been cold and dismissive every time we've asked for something, and now you're questioning whether we even belong here." Thomas shifted slightly in his seat, placing a calming hand on Maya's arm. His voice was low, measured. "Maya, that's enough." But Maya wasn't finished. She shrugged off his hand, her gaze locked on Olivia. "This isn't just about us, Uncle," she said, her voice carrying across the cabin. "It's about standing up to people who think they can treat others like they're less than." A murmur spread through the passengers. Some nodded in agreement, their faces betraying a mix of discomfort and support. Others avoided eye contact altogether, pretending to be engrossed in their phones or in-flight entertainment. Olivia's composure wavered. Her professional facade cracked under the weight of Maya's accusations, and the eyes of the passengers now fixed on her. "I suggest you lower your voice," Olivia said, her words sharp and defensive. "This is not the place for a scene." "Maybe it is," Maya replied, her tone unwavering. "Maybe it's exactly the place to call out behavior like this." Thomas sighed, leaning back in his seat. His calm demeanor never faltered, but his eyes carried a quiet weariness. "Maya," he said again, his voice soft but firm. Maya looked at him, her jaw tight, her breathing steady. Finally, she sank back into her seat, her gaze still fixed on Olivia. The flight attendant took a step back, her grip on the clipboard tightening. She didn't respond, her face unreadable as she turned and walked briskly down the aisle. The cabin remained tense, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Passengers whispered among themselves, their gazes darting between Maya and the retreating figure of Olivia. "Do you think Maya's confrontation was justified? Would you have spoken up or stayed quiet if you were ever in a situation like that? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and hit subscribe button now." The air inside the cabin felt heavier now. Conversations that had once flowed freely were reduced to whispers. The hum of the engine seemed louder in the silence that followed each tense exchange. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes flickering between their own screens and the unmistakable tension brewing a few rows ahead. Olivia's steps were sharper now, her movements no longer carrying the polished grace she had exhibited earlier. There was a tightness in her expression, a strain in her jaw that betrayed her growing frustration. She moved quickly, but her eyes kept returning to the same row, the one where Thomas and Maya sat, quiet but unwavering. Maya was seated upright, her posture rigid, her gaze steady on Olivia. There was no fear in her expression, only defiance. Thomas sat beside her, his hands resting calmly on his lap, his face serene as though the unfolding events hadn't touched him. Olivia stopped near their row, clipboard in hand, her smile gone now, replaced by something sterner. "Is there going to be an issue here?" she asked, her voice louder than necessary, enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. Maya looked up at her, her brow furrowing. "The issue," she said slowly, "is your attitude." A small ripple of sound ran through the cabin. Murmurs, sharp inhales, a passenger clearing their throat. The atmosphere, already tense, seemed to stretch even tighter. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't have time for this," she said curtly. "I'm doing my job, and I expect you to respect that." "Respect?" Maya repeated, her voice calm but pointed. "Is that what you've been showing us?" Thomas glanced at Maya, his face neutral, but his eyes carrying a quiet message of restraint. Maya ignored it. She wasn't done. "You've questioned us. You've ignored us. You've treated us like we don't belong here. And now you want to talk about respect?" Olivia leaned forward slightly, her grip on the clipboard tightening. "I don't appreciate your tone," she said, her voice sharp. "And I don't appreciate your behavior," Maya shot back, her voice steady but growing louder. The murmurs around them grew. Heads turned, necks craned, and a few passengers subtly angled their phones to record the scene. Others whispered to one another, their voices carrying faint phrases like, "What's going on?" and "She's being difficult." Thomas shifted slightly in his seat. "Maya?" he said softly, his tone a quiet warning. Maya glanced at him but didn't back down. "No, Uncle," she said firmly. "She needs to hear this." Olivia's face flushed, her professionalism unraveling with each passing second. "I'm going to ask you one last time to calm down," she said, her voice taut with anger. Maya tilted her head, her voice dropping to an even tone. "And I'm going to ask you one last time, why are you treating us differently?" That was it. The breaking point. Without thinking, without hesitation, Olivia's frustration boiled over. In a single impulsive movement, she reached out and shoved Maya back into her seat. The force wasn't enough to hurt, but it was enough to shock. Maya's back hit the seat with a thud. Gasps erupted across the cabin. The businessman in the next row leaned forward, his face frozen in disbelief. The young man with the phone widened his eyes and whispered, "Did she just?" Before returning to recording. Thomas was on his feet in an instant. His movements were slow but deliberate, his face calm but commanding. He stepped between Maya and Olivia, placing himself firmly in the space that had grown far too hostile. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "There's no need for hostility." Olivia's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She took a step back, her breathing uneven, her grip on the clipboard unsteady. Maya rose to her feet behind Thomas, her eyes blazing. "You put your hands on me," she said, her voice low but charged with emotion. The cabin had become a powder keg, and every passing second felt like a match drawn closer to the fuse. Passengers who had been silently observing now whispered openly, their murmurs blending with the faint hum of the engines. All eyes were fixed on the front rows, where the tension had reached a boiling point. Olivia stood firm, her body stiff with frustration, her hands gripping the edges of her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her, Maya stood upright, her gaze unwavering, her fiery determination etched into every line of her face. Thomas, in between them, remained composed. His calm presence acted as the last fragile thread holding the moment together, though it threatened to snap at any second. Olivia's voice was sharp now, cutting through the thick air like a knife. "If you can't calm down, I'll have no choice but to escalate this further," she said, her tone louder than it needed to be. Maya narrowed her eyes. "Escalate," she said, her words dripping with disbelief. "You're the one who shoved me, and now you want to play the victim?" "I was doing my job," Olivia shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "You're the one making this scene." Nearby passengers leaned closer, their curiosity overpowering their unease. Some shook their heads, others raised their phones to record, but none could look away. Thomas raised his hand slightly, his voice soft but commanding. "Enough," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "Let's end this here. There's no need for this to go any further." But his words fell on deaf ears. Olivia wasn't listening anymore. Not to Thomas, not to Maya, not to the quiet murmurs of the passengers around her. The weight of their stares felt unbearable, their whispers a constant reminder of the judgment she couldn't escape. "You think this is my fault?" she snapped, her eyes darting between Maya and Thomas. "You think I'm the problem?" Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but scathing. "I don't think," she said. "I know." The words hit Olivia like a slap of their own. Her face darkened, her jaw tightened, and her breathing grew shallow. The clipboard in her hands fell to her side, forgotten. "Stop this," Thomas said again, his voice firm. "This has gone far enough." Olivia's gaze shifted to him, and something inside her broke. It wasn't just the frustration or the humiliation, though both were written plainly across her face. It was the weight of everything. Her authority slipping away, her professionalism shattered, the eyes of everyone in the cabin watching her fall apart. Before she could stop herself, before reason could catch up to rage, her hand flew forward. The sound of the slap rang out across the cabin, sharp and jarring, cutting through the murmurs and the hum of the engines like a thunderclap. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Thomas didn't move. He stood tall, his face turned slightly from the force of the blow, his composure unbroken despite the sting that now burned across his cheek. The room held its breath, frozen in shock. Gasps rippled through the cabin, sharp and disbelieving. A woman in the back clasped her hands over her mouth. A man near the aisle dropped his phone in stunned silence. Maya's voice broke through the stillness, sharp and furious. "Do you even know who you just hit?" she shouted, her voice ringing out with a force that filled the entire cabin. "He owns this plane, This airline. The weight of her words landed like a bomb. Passengers murmured louder now, their whispers escalating into a collective gasp of realization. Heads turned to Thomas, whose calm demeanor hadn't faltered, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. Olivia froze, her hand still hovering midair as though she couldn't believe what she'd just done. The color drained from her face, replaced by a pale, ghostly expression of dawning horror. Her eyes widened, darting to Thomas, then to Maya, then to the rows of passengers who were now openly staring, recording, judging. The cabin felt heavier than ever, the atmosphere thick with disbelief. A man in the back muttered, "Did that just happen?" while another passenger shook their head, eyes fixed on Olivia's trembling form. Thomas finally turned to face her, his voice steady, measured, and cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've crossed a line," he said, his tone calm but firm. "This will not end well for you." Passengers watched as Olivia took a step back, her hand falling limp to her side. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Whatever she had intended to say died in her throat, leaving only silence in its wake. Maya stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "This is going to cost you more than just your job," she said, her words slicing through Olivia's crumbling composure. The slap had shattered more than the silence in the cabin. It had cracked through the carefully constructed world Olivia clung to, leaving her exposed in a way she couldn't recover from. The room was heavy with disbelief. The hum of the engines, no longer a soothing backdrop, but a constant reminder of the uncomfortable reality now gripping everyone on board. Thomas stood there, calm, unmoving, his cheeks still faintly red from the strike. His steady gaze locked onto Olivia, who looked as though the ground beneath her had shifted entirely. Her hand trembled at her side, her face a mask of shock and growing regret. Passengers murmured around them, their voices a mix of outrage and astonishment. "Did she just slap him?" someone whispered. "What happens now?" another said, their voice barely audible over the rising tension. Olivia opened her mouth, the beginnings of an apology forming on her lips, but nothing came out. The judging eyes of the passengers rendered her silent. Maya's voice cut through the noise, sharp and unforgiving. "Save it," she snapped, her eyes blazing as she stared Olivia down. "Whatever excuse you're about to make, don't bother. Your actions already spoke loud enough." Thomas turned his gaze to the cabin, his calm demeanor carrying an authority that quieted the murmurs. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but it carried the weight of what had just transpired. "Moments like this," he began, "remind us how far we still have to go. Bias is insidious, and it doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides in small actions, in dismissive tones, in judgmental stares. But when left unchecked, it escalates into moments like this." The passengers fell silent, his words sinking in. Maya crossed her arms, her anger still simmering, but her uncle's composure kept her grounded. Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with deliberate calm. He dialed a number, raising it to his ear as Olivia stared at him, her expression shifting from shock to outright panic. "Captain," Thomas said after a brief pause, his voice even, "I'm requesting the immediate removal of a crew member at the next available stop. I trust you'll handle it with discretion." He paused, listening to the captain's response, then added, "Thank you. I'll expect a report on this incident as well." Olivia's breath hitched audibly. She stepped forward, her hands raised slightly, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Mr. Thomas, please," she stammered. "I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking. I'm sorry. Truly, I am." Thomas regarded her with a steady gaze, his expression unreadable. Before he could respond, Maya stepped in, her tone cutting. "Sorry doesn't erase what you did," she said coldly. "It doesn't undo the slap, the humiliation, or the disrespect you've shown since the moment we boarded this plane. You don't get to hide behind an apology now that you realize who he is." The cabin murmured again, some passengers nodding in agreement while others continued to record the unfolding scene. Thomas raised his hand slightly, silencing Maya. Enough, he said gently. He turned his attention back. You're right about one thing, he said, his voice calm but firm. You made a mistake, and mistakes have consequences. Olivia's eyes widened. Please, Mr. Thomas, You struck me, he interrupted, his voice growing colder. That is not just a mistake. It is a crime, and crimes are not erased with apologies. The murmurs grew louder, the weight of his words settling over the cabin. Olivia's face drained of color as Thomas continued. Assault is a serious matter, and it will be treated as such. I will be pressing charges. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. The businessman across the aisle nodded approvingly, while the young man with the phone whispered, "This is going to go viral." Thomas straightened his posture, his gaze steady on Olivia. Accountability is key, he said simply, and that begins now. At that moment, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing an unscheduled landing for a crew-related incident. Passengers exchanged looks, the tension thick but now tinged with anticipation. When the plane touched down, the doors opened to reveal uniformed officers waiting at the base of the stairs. Olivia's breath quickened, her hands trembling as two officers stepped on board, their presence commanding immediate attention. "Miss," one of them said, their tone professional but firm, "you've been accused of assault. We need you to come with us." Olivia's knees buckled slightly as the officers approached. "Please," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "this isn't necessary." But the officers weren't swayed. One of them gently took her arm, guiding her toward the exit as the passengers watched in stunned silence. Maya turned to her uncle, her expression softening as the tension in the cabin began to ease. "Uncle," she said quietly, "you didn't have to press charges." Thomas looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, I did," he replied, "because it's not just about me. It's about what this moment represents, and it's about ensuring it doesn't happen again." Do you think Mr. Thomas overreacted by pressing charges? Share your thoughts in the comments below and click on the subscribe button now, only if you think prejudice should not be tolerated. As Olivia was escorted off the plane, the passengers began to clap, a quiet, hesitant applause that grew louder as it spread through the cabin. Thomas stood there for a moment, his calm demeanor unshaken, before turning to address the passengers one last time. "Thank you for your patience," he said. "This wasn't how anyone wanted this flight to go, but moments like this remind us of the importance of standing up for what's right. Bias, prejudice, they don't belong anywhere, least of all here. And today, we've taken a step toward ensuring that message is clear." The applause swelled, and for the first time since the ordeal began, the cabin felt lighter. Olivia didn't resist as they gently guided her toward the exit. Her head was lowered, her steps hesitant. The weight of every eye in the cabin followed her, the silence heavier than the murmurs that had preceded it. As she descended the stairs, escorted by the officers, she glanced back one last time, her gaze meeting Thomas's. He didn't look away. Inside the terminal, passengers that recorded the ordeal wasted no time uploading the footage, adding a brief but pointed caption. "This is what happens when prejudice goes unchecked." Accountability is the first step. Within minutes, the video began to spread. Comments flooded in, some outraged, others supportive, all of them united in disbelief at what they had witnessed. By the time Thomas and Maya reached their destination, the clip had already amassed thousands of views. By the end of the day, it had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the scene over and over. The slap, the gasps, Maya's fiery words, "Do you even know who you just hit? He owns this plane." It was everywhere, on televisions, on social media, in conversations across the globe. The airline responded quickly, issuing a public apology. They condemned Olivia's actions, promising a thorough investigation and new training protocols to prevent such incidents in the future. But the damage was already done. Olivia's name became a trending topic, her actions dissected and criticized by millions. She released a statement through her lawyer apologizing for what she called an unacceptable lapse in judgment. But for many, the apology rang hollow. The world had seen what happened, and words were not enough to erase it. Maya watched the fallout unfold with a sense of vindication. She scrolled through the comments on her video, some praising her for speaking up, others debating the deeper issues of bias and prejudice. Thomas, however, remained quiet. He spent the evening preparing for the conference, his focus unwavering despite the storm swirling around him. When the day of the keynote arrived, the conference hall was packed. The audience buzzed with anticipation, many of them aware of the viral video and eager to hear Thomas's perspective. He stepped onto the stage with the same calm demeanor he carried through life. There was no need for dramatics. His presence alone commanded the room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Today, I was meant to speak to you about progress, about the steps we've taken as a society to build a better, more equitable world. But recent events have reminded me, and perhaps all of us, that the journey is far from over." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. "Prejudice," he continued, "often hides behind uniforms, titles, or authority. It doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it manifests in a glance, a tone, a question that should never have been asked. And sometimes it escalates into something much worse." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "What I experienced on that flight was not unique. It was not isolated. It was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that we must confront, not with anger, but with courage, grace, and unwavering resolve. We cannot fight prejudice with prejudice. We cannot overcome hatred with hatred. But we can challenge it, we can hold it accountable, and we can demand better." Maya sat in the audience, her hands folded in her lap, her expression a mixture of pride and emotion. As her uncle spoke, she saw the impact his words had on the room. Heads nodded, eyes glistened. The truth he spoke was undeniable. Thomas ended his speech with a simple but powerful message. The fight isn't over, but every step forward matters. The audience rose to their feet, the sound of their applause filling the hall. As the conference wrapped up, news outlets eagerly reported on Thomas's speech, weaving it into the broader narrative sparked by the viral video. The world was watching, and the conversation had begun. In the days that followed, the video continued to spark debate. It became more than just a story about a flight. It became a symbol of the challenges still faced by millions every day. People shared their own experiences, their own stories of prejudice and resilience, creating a global dialogue that refused to be ignored. In a quiet moment back at their hotel, Maya turned to her uncle. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked. Thomas looked at her, his expression soft but resolute. "We've opened a door," he said. "Now it's up to others to walk through it." The story ends not with a conclusion, but with a continuation, a reminder that change is never complete, but always possible. If this story moved you, share it with others. Reflect and share your own experiences with us. And most importantly, stand up for what's right. The fight isn't over, but every step forward matters. Subscribe now and stand up for what's right, one story at a time.